May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
Please be seated.
I have to admit that this part of the story we hear in the Old Testament, leaves me a bit baffled. We speak of our God as a God of love, and that we are all children of the one God who has created us all. Richard Rohr, I believe it was, says that we are all either children of the one God, or there was more than one God in creation. I'm also reminded of something I've more recently seen, and I don't know the source or the author, but it says something along the lines of, God hates all the same people that you do, then you might be making God in your own image. But whatever our thoughts on this troubling chapter, we will look at it as part of the larger story. Moses had died before entering the Promised Land, and Joshua has taken over as Moses' successor. He's conquered most of the land promised to Abraham and his descendants. But there are still pockets of peoples who inhabited the lands when the Hebrews arrived. The lands are divided into each of the 12 tribes, and all is well. At least for the time that Joshua is alive, and through the lives of those who have been in the wilderness with him and crossed over the Jordan. But as that original memory of all that God had done for them died along with those who had experienced it firsthand, those who had been living in these lands, and especially the Canaanites, worshipped Baal, a god often linked with weather and fertility. And since it's often easier to go along with the local cultural norms than to stay true to your own God, even the God that has rescued your ancestors from slavery in Egypt. I also wonder if there's any other factors involved. The ancient Mideastern religions most often use statues and artwork to depict their gods. This worship of the depiction of a god was so ingrained that if you remember, even the Hebrews, as they were being led out of slavery in Egypt, convinced Aaron to cast an idol of gold, while Moses spoke with the living God on Mount Sinai. To this day, we have trouble honoring and worshiping a God that we've only heard about and not experienced for ourselves. But whatever the reason, God's chosen people turned away from their living God and began to worship Baal and fall away from living the way of the Lord. And now, as we enter the more difficult part of the story, we also see the repetition of the cycle that we often saw in Genesis, that of sin, judgment, repentance, forgiveness, and sin once again. In this book of Judges, the word that translates into judge is shofet, which can also be translated as a chieftain or a leader. The Hebrews fall away from following their God, begin to be led by what is more acceptable in their cultural context. The Hebrews are attacked and defeated by some powerful remnant of the previous occupants and live in servitude until God sends another judge or leader to free them. All seems to go well until that leader dies. And then the cycle begins again. War, servitude, release, peace, and then turning away from God again. As in the story of Joshua, the death and destruction attributed to God is overwhelming. But there are some interesting pieces in these stories. The judges, the leaders, are drawn from various components of the Hebrew people. Military leaders, warriors, prophets, and priests were called to lead God's people. And not only men, but women were called to lead the Hebrews and do the work to free them once again. And there's humor. Did you know that King Eglon was killed in his bathroom? And bravery. when Joel, the wife of Heber, drives the 10th stake through the temple of the general Sisera, defeating the Canaanites for the army of the Hebrews. And the famous story of Samson and Delilah, which is hard for me to read without thinking, just how stupid could Samson be? Continuing to trust Delilah after she's shown herself to be untrustworthy 3 times. But good triumphs in the end, and the Philistines were ultimately defeated by Samson's hand. And the people continued, apparently unable to know what is good, what is right, without someone to lead them, someone to tell them. And so the story continues.